We don't talk about Rhinedottir enough. Which is funny because technically speaking, she was our first look into the sinners. And in fact, there was a time when she was thought to be the only sinner and the sole cause of the Conrian Cataclysm. Those were simpler times. But in actuality, Rhinedottir was a simple alchemist, a master of chemia, researching the fundamental principles of life. And most of her known work revolved around that topic. But when looking at her long list of accomplishments, one has to ask, why are there so many abyssal dragons? Okay, maybe so many is a bit of an exaggeration since there are only 3 that we know about, but she still makes more dragons than any other kind of creation. And I can't help but wonder if there's a connection between her research into the fundamental principles of life and her attempts to create dragons. Like, maybe the goal was never to create a dragon in the first place. Maybe she was trying to make something else, and dragons were just a byproduct, a manifestation of her failed attempts. But if her primary research topic was the fundamental principles of life, then that suggests that there's a deep connection between life itself and dragons. And of course, if all those dragons are abyssal, then there must be some connection between life and the abyss as well. And of course, this mystery was something I just had to investigate, so I set out to answer the question of why Rhinedottir makes dragons. And I found the answer in the book, Flowers for Princess Fischl. And obviously, since I am making this video, I thought the answer was worth sharing. So today, I will be walking you through my investigation of Rhinedottir and dragons and the abyss and why it all connects to Fischl. And listen, I'm as surprised as you that I started looking into a sinner and ended up at Fischl, who is supposed to judge the sinners. I really wonder what kind of surprise I'd be in for if I went looking into the other sinners as well. Now, while we only have time to go into the work of one sinner for today, if the work of that one sinner is not enough for you, then perhaps you'd enjoy the addition of 6 more sins, thanks to the sponsor of today's video, 7 Deadly Sins Origin and PlayStation. This latest installment of the 7 Deadly Sins storyline is a fully open-world multiplayer real-time action RPG following the story of Prince Tristan and his quest to save the world of Britannia from total timeline collapse, which was caused by the activation of a mystical artifact known only as the Book of Stars. But you and Tristan won't have to do it alone. Not only will you be able to recruit allies from a colorful cast of characters, but thanks to a robust co-op mode, you'll also be able to meet other players at the town square, join guilds, tackle challenging multiplayer boss fights, and you can even play through the story alongside your friends instead of doing it alone. And this massive open world is full of secrets to uncover, treasure to discover, and a wide range of unique traversal options, including mounts, which you can find, capture, and train in the open world. And like all good action games, 7 Deadly Sins Origin has robust combat challenges for you to tackle and countless ways to do it, because every character has not 1, but 3 different weapons they can use, and thus 3 different playstyles to master. So you can customize your characters to suit your playstyle. 7 Deadly Sins Origin is available now on the PlayStation 5, so if you'd like to join Tristan and save Britannia, then you can use the link in the description to download 7 Deadly Sins Origin completely for free right now. A big thanks to 7 Deadly Sins Origin and PlayStation for sponsoring this video. And now we're going to begin our investigation into the Abyss and Rhinedottir and her draconic creations and their connections to Fischl. And this investigation begins with the most boring of all topics, a cursory look into what we know about the Abyss. In Homeward He Who Caught the Wind, we learned that Barbeleth believes the Abyss is the resentment of timelines not chosen, and everything in those timelines that wasn't chosen. And frankly, this is one of the most explicit explanations of the Abyss we've ever received, at least in quest dialogue, because technically speaking, this exact definition is written in the Festering Desire, which was available back in, version 1.2. But there is a key difference between the description that is presented in Festering Desire and Barbeleth's theory, and that difference comes down to resentment, because as explicit as the description in Festering Desire is, it never, ever, ever mentions resentment or any kind of negative emotion. Now, I'm not saying that Barbeleth is wrong exactly, but when 2 sources agree on one thing but disagree on another, you have to bring the part they disagree with into question. So while our sources agree that the Abyss is made up of discarded material, which we'll talk about later, I think Alice has misled us by describing the Abyss as resentful, because that makes it seem like the Abyss as a phenomenon has emotions, and that's objectively false. Everything we learned and witnessed in Natlan argues the opposite position, that the Abyss is unfeeling and unthinking. And that position is supported by Skirk, who argues that the Abyss is just a natural, neutral force that can be destructive, sure, but it certainly isn't malicious. It's no different from other natural disasters like floods or hurricanes. Those are also powerful destructive forces, but like the abyss, they do not possess thoughts or feelings. A flood doesn't wreck your home because it hates you. Now that said, I do think there's a good reason that Barbelith and Alice are arguing for a resentful abyss, but I think it has more to do with something that is in the abyss than it does the abyss itself. But to understand what I mean and why it matters, you need a deeper understanding of how the abyss works, so stick with me for a second. During her story quest, Skirk told us that the abyss is the power of the Void Realm, a realm that stands opposed to the Light Realm, and between these two realms stands the human or mortal realm, where Teyvat lies. Now, the Light Realm is also called the Elemental Realm, and it's also the place from which dragons like Nibelung and the Sovereigns come from. So by default, they possess Light Realm power, which is also known as Elemental power, and it is a power which is inherently linked to that of creation. Elemental power specifically is said to make up the building blocks of the world of Teyvat, which means that this world was built with light power. So if light power is the power of creation, then the opposite power, void power, should be the power of the uncreation. Notice how I didn't say destruction. That's because I think destruction or erosion actually happens in the human realm, in between the light and void realm. And I think the Mage's Bubble World is actually a pretty good example of this. Think of the Bubble World as a representation of the human realm. Whenever Nicole destroys something in the human realm, it turns into abyssal energy. So she created the world using light magic, then destroyed things in the human realm that were then discarded or placed into the abyssal realm. So the light realm creates, the human realm destroys, discards, or consumes, and the resulting dross ends up in the void realm. That means you can think of the abyss as something like the landfill of the universe. And like a landfill, it is full of everything, both animate and inanimate, which is one of the big reasons why I think it's unlikely that the abyss would naturally exhibit any sort of emotions. But again, we'll come back to that. Now, this creation, destruction, refuse pipeline cannot be a one-way relationship, or else one day you're just gonna run out of light energy, and at that point, all creation stops, and so does the whole world. It would just bring about the apocalypse. So logically speaking, the discarded material in the Void Realm would need to be transformed back into some sort of substance that the Light Realm could use for creation at some point, which would allow for a sustainable closed-loop system. To me, this is kind of like how poop can be composted so that it can be used to grow food, which is then eaten and turned into more poop, which then turns into food, and the process repeats and you get the idea. Nature is full of situations like these because nature is cyclical by design, which means that this process of decomposition and decay that's associated with the abyss is not just important, it is a necessary part of the cycle of life itself, even on a macrocosmic scale. And this cyclical process is actually referenced by Rhinedottir and Albedo's description of the 4 stages of alchemy, which is by definition the art of creation and uncreation. The creation process starts with the Nigredo stage, also known as humus. It's the stage that represents raw materials, and it's named after the color black, a reference to the richest, darkest, composted soil you can find. And in Genshin, it's also a direct reference to the abyss itself. Abyssal dragons are often referred to as part of the humus stage. Or maybe it's pronounced humus, I'm not actually sure. We gardeners just call it compost, or good dirt. From there, the fully decomposed matter is processed and then purified during the albedo stage, which is named after the color white. I like to think of this stage as like taking a bunch of chaotic matter and sorting it into categories. So if Nigredo is like a box of unsorted random Legos, then the albedo stage is taking those Legos and sorting them into piles based on size, shape, and color. From there, that purified matter is given shape during the rubido or building stage. So it's when you snap all those Lego bricks together. And the alchemical process is considered complete during the citrinitas or gold stage. That is when you reveal your completed Lego tower. Now there are 2 directions to go from here. Either you can completely smash your tower in an act of destruction and immediately put it back to a Nigredo stage of random chaotic blocks, or you can run through the stages of alchemy backwards and uncreate it by removing each brick individually, placing them back into their neatly ordered and organized piles. Either way, your object goes back to a Nigredo state, and I think this process of uncreation or destruction is what abyssal corrosion actually is. It's alchemy in reverse. It's decomposition. Now, as a force made up of uncreated material, the Abyss's only purpose is to be transmuted into a creation. So if the Abyss were to have any wishes or will of its own, it would simply be a wish to exist. And that is why, in its natural state, the Abyss is predominantly mimetic. If an outside force will not aid in its recreation, it will attempt to create or order itself by mimicking already existing life forms, because that is the natural process of the universe. That is what it is supposed to do. Now, the reason I brought up all this alchemy stuff is because the Bubble World event also references the Traveler's ability to purify the Abyss. But Skirk seems pretty certain that the Traveler isn't purifying anything at all. And based on her lines, plus the Fate's Course intertwined wind glider, as well as how the purification process is visually depicted, it seems as though the Traveler is merely absorbing abyssal energy into their body, where it will eventually be transmuted into the Traveler's unique golden energy. That means they're using their body as a crucible to perform alchemy. They take that raw Nigredo abyssal material and they process it until it reaches its final Citrinitas form. Maybe the reason they call it purification is because that's what we call the albedo stage of alchemy, and that's the one that immediately comes after the Nigredo stage. Anyway, my main point here is that the Abyss is not inherently resentful. It is just a powerful, neutral, and necessary force that very few people understand and even fewer people can control. And besides, if the Abyss were malicious or resentful by nature, then Skirk wouldn't be able to use it to replace her missing limbs. And it also would have been impossible for Skirk's homeworld to peacefully coexist with the Abyss, which it did. Because remember, her planet was not destroyed by the Abyss, it was destroyed by people who were scared of the Abyss. And people are always afraid of things they don't understand. But okay, if the Abyss is a neutral force of uncreated material, then why does Barbelith and Alice call the Abyss resentful? Well, I personally think it's possible that there is something or someone in the Abyss who has not yet fully decomposed, and their lingering will and resentment is being amplified by the Abyss's natural inclination towards mimicry. And yes, this is relevant in figuring out why Rhinedottir makes dragons. And yes, we will still be talking about Fischl. You gotta trust the process. Talking about discarded things full of resentment immediately makes me think of Nibelung for one big reason. See, as far as I can tell, there is no record of the Abyss threatening Teyvat during Nibelung's time ruling it. And as an entity that was born alongside the world, that may have been because he was the creative force that kept the discarded material cycling through the creation process. That way, it couldn't really build up and threaten the stability of the mortal realm. Alternatively, the world could have just been too young and didn't have enough refuse yet. Again, as far as I can tell, the Abyss only shows up in Teyvat's records around the time Nibelung returns to Teyvat and finds it conquered by the heavenly principles. Now, you could argue that Nibelung brought the Abyss back as a souvenir of his stellar journey that he went on with the sole purpose of investigating the abyssal threat in the greater universe, but I don't think that's the case, because in the one depiction we have of Nibelung fighting the heavenly principles during the War of Funerary Flame, when he returned from his investigation into the abyss of the universe, he has not yet been corrupted by the abyss. He is still a pure white dragon. And also, the interpretation that Nibelung was corrupted by the abyss during his journey contradicts what Apep tells us, because she said that Nibelung returned to Teyvat and then told her that the only way to fight the heavenly principles was to obtain forbidden knowledge. But this discussion could not have happened before he left for outer space, because the heavenly principles wouldn't have arrived yet. So any corruption he would have experienced would have happened in Teyvat and not as a result of his travels. I know it sounds like I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent here, but this is kind of important. Because while forbidden knowledge is sometimes described as a form of abyssal power, I do think the fact that Apep is making a distinction between abyssal power and forbidden knowledge is important. Because it suggests that Nibelung wasn't looking to use the power of the abyss itself, he was instead looking to use the power of something found inside of the abyss. To put it another way, thinking of the abyss as like a big dumpster, Nibelung wasn't looking to dive into the dumpster and then start yeeting pieces of trash at the heavenly principles. He instead was diving into the dumpster to find something specific that was thrown into it. So he wasn't looking for anything that was labeled trash, he was looking for something very specific in the trash. Now keep this in mind, because there was one monumental event that occurred right after Nibelung retrieved this so-called forbidden knowledge from the abyssal trash. And that was Nibelung's battle and loss against the heavenly principles. Now what do you think the heavenly principles did with Nibelung after he lost? They probably discarded him, trapped him in the abyss, locked him in the dumpster of Tevat. And if we compare this scenario with that of the mage's bubble world, then Nicole is effectively acting as the heavenly principles here. She's discarding everything she deems unnecessary or unwanted, and those discarded things eventually turn into abyssal corruption. Now, it's important to note that Nicole specifically discards events from her bubble world, and that ends up changing the entire story contained within the bubble. And I think this perfectly encapsulates what I think happened with Nibelung. I think that he probably had a story of the world in mind before he left, the natural course of the world that Tevat was supposed to follow. But I also think that the heavenly principles threw it out and either left a gap where it should be, or tried to replace it with their own version of the story, which then led to a lot of abyssal corruption throughout the world. And to that end, I would like to propose the idea that forbidden knowledge is the remnants of the original story that Nibelung wrote. And I say this because forbidden knowledge appears to be just memories. Like in the chasm, forbidden knowledge was stabilized by the celestial nail and converted into dark mud, which was actually memories that couldn't be tampered with by Irminsul. And these memories are described as not belonging to or rejected by the world itself. And in my opinion, this explains why Nibelung felt like he needed forbidden knowledge to fight the heavenly principles. He was trying to fight a new copy of the world story with the original copy of the world story. This is very similar to what happened with Durin and Mini Durin, wherein one story was trying to replace the other. And the rules of Tevat do not allow two copies of the same story to exist at the same time, hence why one needs to be discarded. But there also needs to be something in place to keep that version of the story discarded. Otherwise, Tevat's naturally self-correcting behavior of trying to make sure there's only one version of the story will try to default back to its original version. So we're basically in a situation wherein both Nibelung and the heavenly principles were trying to write the story of Tevat, but only one version could exist at a time. So the discarded version, which is Nibelung's version in this case, was cast into the abyss. And that's what I think forbidden knowledge is. Now, the reason I think forbidden knowledge is in Sumeru is because of Irminsul. See, Nahida says that the abyss adjusts its shape to match the region that it's in. But if the abyss is just discarded material, then is it not possible that the heavenly principles is simply discarding something important from each region? And these so-called customized abyssal disasters are just the abyss trying to restore itself to its original form. But it can't because it's being rejected by Tevat's current ruler. If so, then forbidden knowledge being the original story of the world makes sense in Sumeru because that is where the current version of the story of the world is stored. Now, I think the reason why it was so critical that Nibelung retrieved the forbidden knowledge, the original script and story of the world, is because it's not just the story of Tevat, it's the story of Nibelung. If we were to look at Durin as an allegory for Nibelung, then we should note that Mini Durin, the new Durin, was born from a storybook that contained an entire world. A storybook world that was written and created specifically for him, which means that the story within that storybook world is Durin's story. Durin's story is that of Simulanka. And because he was born alongside it and as a result of it, he cannot be separated from it, even as his story was merged into another story. Simulanka is still a core part of his identity and a core part of him. Now, likewise, Nibelung was born alongside Tevat. So that would make Tevat his storybook world. And like Durin, I don't think that you can separate Nibelung from Tevat because the story of Tevat is the story of Nibelung. If you were to act like Nicole with respect to her bubble world and just discard whatever you didn't like whenever you wanted to, you wouldn't just be getting rid of parts of the world, you'd be getting rid of parts of the main character of that world. And in the case of Tevat, that was Nibelung. That means that the heavenly principles was slowly eroding the power of the dragon over time, and his foray into Tevat's abyss was to retrieve the missing pieces of himself. His own story, which had been labeled forbidden knowledge. Now, I'm not just making some wild random claim because it feels good, I actually do have rationale for this. But to explain it, we're gonna have to step into the real world for a little bit. So Nibelung gets his name from the German epic Nibelungenlied, or Song of the Nibelung. In this context, Nibelung specifically refers to a clan or lineage of people that's featured within the epic, making this epic the story of the Nibelungs. Now, HoYoverse as a company loves the Song of the Nibelungs, and they reference it every chance they get. But they are particularly fond of Richard Wagner's operatic interpretation of the tale, The Ring of the Nibelung, or The Ring Cycle. Now, if this were any other video, this is the point where I would start giving giving you guys a synopsis of the plot and telling you which parts of it Genshin is referencing and where. But today, I actually want to focus more on Wagner himself and why Hoyoverse is fixating on this opera in particular. See, Wagner had a very interesting philosophical stance on the arts, especially when it came to the theater. To Wagner, the theater was like the truest form of art itself because it could make use of every artistic discipline. Fashion, architecture, sculpture, song, dance, poetry, prose. The theater could make use of it all. But Wagner also hated the theater of his time because he felt as though no performance was able to achieve a true synthesis of all the arts. So he made it his dream to create the perfect theatrical production, the perfect synthesis of every type of artwork in one glorious show. He called this idealist theatrical concept Gesamtkunstwerk, or the holistic work, because it was an artwork that was meant to contain all other artworks. And after 26 years, he completed his own Gesamtkunstwerk with the publication of the opera Ring of the Nibelung. All this to say that Gesamtkunstwerk is Nibelung, not just for Wagner, but for Genshin as well. In Flowers for Princess Fischl, see I told you we'd get here, the doomsday beast threatening the Immernachtreich is literally called Gesamtkunstwerk. And although it's referred to as the beast of the world and not a dragon specifically, the of the world descriptor does line up with how Nibelung was born alongside the world of Teyvat. And I am dead certain it is supposed to be a dragon, because during the second Golden Apple Archipelago event, the narrator reads us several excerpts from the Flowers for Princess Fischl books. And we also get to witness a play about Fischl, and in both of these stories, the Immernachtreich is threatened not by the Gesamtkunstwerk beast of the world, but by the dragon Tarask. And the Tarask is almost certain to be the Gesamtkunstwerk beast because the beast is described as having a battle strength of around 30, and in Dungeons & Dragons Forgotten Realms, the Tarask has a challenge rating of 30. Battle strength and challenge rating are basically the same thing, and I want to thank Argentum for pointing this out to me. And I know that this Dungeons & Dragons reference feels a bit random and probably irrelevant, but I think anyone who's skeptical about this comparison should just go to the Forbidden Realms wiki and click around. I think you'll find the dominoes stack up rather quickly. But the main takeaway here is that the Gesamtkunstwerk beast is Tarask, and both of them are dragons, and both of them are beasts of the world, okay? Bottom line. Now, in Flowers for Princess Fischl, Gesamtkunstwerk is mentioned alongside an unknown opera writer, which is a very obvious reference to Wagner, and also the main reason why we know that this term is referring to his works and philosophies specifically, rather than some more generic usage of the term. Now, does this distinction matter? Yes, it does, because Wagner's ideal Gesamtkunstwerk stimulated every one of the human senses. His theater was completely dark except for the spotlights on the stage. Music obscured the sounds outside the building. The set pieces were convincing enough to make the audience believe that they were looking at a real place. And the actors moved with such passion that the audience shared a single emotional response to every plot twist in unison. See, Wagner's Gesamtkunstwerk wasn't just theater, it was immersive theater, a phantasmagoria, if you will. It was a performance that was so encapsulating and engrossing that the audience forgot about the world beyond the stage. And this was exactly what Wagner wanted. He wanted the audience to be convinced that the stage was the entire world, that his Gesamtkunstwerk was the world, that Nibelung was the world. Nivelette's vision story actually makes a lot more sense once you think of Nibelung as a manifestation of the world of Teyvat itself. The text says that after Nibelung was defeated during the War of Funerary Flame, the heavenly principles and another unknown entity created the Gnosis for the sole purpose of, quote, subduing and controlling the resentments and loathing of the world. Note that it doesn't say the abyss. So my thought is that after being defeated, the world, or rather Nibelung, would have been full of resentment and perhaps formed the basis of Teyvat's abyss. Because if Nibelung is the world, then everything that is discarded within the world is also a part of Nibelung. So while the abyss as a phenomenon may not be a resentful thing, Nibelung had the will the size of a world because he was a world, so he was very likely the source of the resentment that Barbeleth talks about. And in Chenyu Vale, Lingwang and Fujin explain that the abyssal miasma was a symptom of the earth resisting change, and that the natural order of the world was actually being suppressed. And that lines up with what we know about the Gnosis and also about the celestial nails, because those also suppress the abyss. Now, what do you think happens when the natural order of the resentful old world can no longer be suppressed? Well, if we look at Durin as an example, then we would assume that the abyss takes over, right? And if that happened worldwide, well, that sounds like the start of the apocalypse to me, which is very appropriate thematically, since the dragon, Narzissenkruez WQ, is a herald of the end times in Flowers for Princess Fischl, and his secondary title of Beast of the World may actually be a reference to the Beast of the Earth from the Quran. Because this Beast of the Earth, or Daba min al-Ard, I'm sorry, I tried, is also a beast that appears during the end times, and it gets its name because it comes from beneath the earth. You know, the same place where the abyss in Tevat is supposed to be. A similar story appears in the Bible where the Beast of the Earth emerges from underground at the end times, and it's one of 3 beasts, each related to a 7-headed dragon that was trapped in the abyss and represents the power opposing God, which in our case would be the heavenly principles, so that kind of lines up with Nibelung. Interestingly, the Daba also exists as a plurality, meaning the term doesn't just refer to one beast, but also many, and sometimes the amalgamation of many beasts. And that lines up with what we see in Flowers for Princess Fischl, because there it says that when the Narzissenkruez WQ appears on Tevat, many other beasts of the world will appear throughout the universe. So not in Tevat, but the whole universe. Which does raise the question as to whether or not Nibelung's current alleged predicament is not unique to Tevat, but has happened to multiple planets, which would have created a sort of legion of vexed dragons that command the abyss within the depths of space. Of course, this is providing that Flowers for Princess Fischl is accurately describing some true aspects of Genshin's universe, which I personally think it is, because, you know, it was written by Nicole, the history enthusiast, and also her Sealy buddy, Mr. 9. And they tend to base their stories on at least a few granules of truth. And it is within these little grains of what I perceive to be truth that I found the answer to my original question: why Rhinedottir makes so many dragons. So Rhinedottir is an alchemist, and like most alchemists, she intends to one day produce a magnum opus, also called the Great Work, Masterwork, Holistic Work, or Philosopher's Stone. Traditionally, a magnum opus would require the alchemist to take the prima materia, more on that in a second, and manipulate it through the 4 alchemical stages that we talked about earlier: nigredo, albedo, rubedo, and citrinitas. The prima materia is described as the most primordial form of matter, akin to the boundless chaos that existed at the beginning of time, which, to me, sounds like the abyss. Heck, even Jung calls it the abyss, and Genshin loves referencing Carl Jung, or at least referencing the stuff that Carl Jung based his work on. Hard to say. Now, the prima materia is directly connected to the concept of the anima mundi, or the world soul, which is precisely what I think Nibelung is supposed to be. And my reasoning is based in both Hermetic and Jungian alchemical philosophy. For starters, the anima mundi is supposed to be the spirit of nature, the soul that inhabits the body of the earth, and as a soul, it represents the alchemical element of air, ether, or vapor. So I think Nibelung is appropriately named because the root word for the name, Nibel, means mist, fog, vapor, or cloud. Now, conveniently, the anima mundi is supposed to be the soul of all things, which means it takes the shape of a blend of all living beings, hence why it's sometimes called the monstrum hermaphroditum, so like a hermaphroditic monster. But when the anima mundi is referred to in a mythological sense, it's almost always referred to as a serpent, dragon, fish, raven, or a bird without wings. Now, I want to pause here for a second because we have basically just described the Asiatic dragon, a wingless, serpentine manifestation of the natural order of the world that appears as a mixture of many different animals. This description, by the way, also fits the Daba, our resident beast of the earth. Coincidence? I'm not convinced. I would also like to point out that Rhinedottir wasn't just an alchemist. She was an artist who practiced alchemy through her artwork, similarly to Albedo, who loves to draw things into existence. Rift wolves, for example, are said to be her discarded drawings, and if her other abyssal monsters were created in a similar way, then they would have all had to have been products of art of some sort, right? So it's interesting to note that there is a similarity between alchemy's pursuit of the great work and the artist's pursuit of the Narzissenkruez WQ, which in modern times has come to be known as just the ideal artwork. To me, both of these things are just the creation of worlds. Alchemy is trying to unravel the mysteries of the physical world and ultimately find a way to create a physical world, whereas the greatest thing an artist could ever create is a world through their artwork. So my hypothesis is that Rhinedottir makes dragons because she is studying the art of creation, and the ultimate form of creation is a world, because a dragon encompasses the form of all things. If those things have been created or chosen, then you would have a dragon representing all created and chosen things. And if those things have been uncreated or not yet chosen, then that dragon would represent the infinite possibilities, all the things that could be created or timelines that could be chosen. So with all that in mind, I am of the opinion that the abyssal phenomenon that is spreading throughout the universe, not just into that, may in fact be mostly benign. It's just a glut of uncreated prima materia, and I think this glut may have been caused by an increase in dying worlds or dying dragons, some of which may have died due to natural causes, because, nothing lasts forever, but some of them may have forcefully been discarded like Nibelung. So they, like Nibelung, may have resentments that lingered in the depths of the abyssal matter. And this could have made the abyss appear to be aggressive and threatening to civilizations like the one the merchants who visited Skirk's planet belonged to. They would have been understandably terrified of it. So when they saw Skirk's people coexisting with their world and its associated abyssal prima materia, they immediately labeled it as a threat despite their hypothetical dragon world soul having no hostile intent. Now, all this stuff about abyssal dragons might sound at odds with what I said earlier about dragons coming from the light realm, except it's not. Remember that the light realm is the power of creation, while the void or abyss realm should be made up of discarded creations. And you can't just create or discard indefinitely without creating an imbalance between the two realms. The relationship must be cyclical in order to maintain balance between the realms. And that's why I think the alchemical process is a representation of this relationship. And the fun part about this idea is that in Chinese Taoism, the dragon is the symbol for alchemy because the dragons are a symbol for transformation, or transmutation. This is in part because dragons are manifestations of the natural world, and thus they rule over the cyclical nature of nature. And these ideas can actually be found in Hermetic alchemy because the alchemical dragon of Hermeticism often takes the shape of an Ouroboros, an entity that constantly consumes and renews itself, a wingless serpent that represents the cyclicality of nature. This draconic ring represents the life cycle of the world, the ring cycle. And if a dragon is also the soul of the world, or just the world itself, then the body of a dragon is also the crucible for the alchemy of life. It is both light and dark, and everything in between. And you know who else uses their body as a crucible for alchemy, turning abyssal power into light power? That's right, it's the Traveler. And they also have a will to rival the world because they're a descender, meaning they potentially have the ability to perform the role of a dragon, which is a very interesting concept when you start noticing all the stories and legends in Teyvat which talk about heroes becoming dragons by the end of their stories. And also when you remember that people like Rene, who attempted to become a descender like the Traveler, did so by melting down their body into its base material, which in this case was primordial seawater, and then fusing with all sorts of other people, which turned themselves into a mixture of every person that they consumed. And that is why Narzissenkruez is referred to as a dragon throughout the questline. A dragon is just a chimeric creature. It's what you call a mixture of multiple or all life forms. And this Rene turned Narzissenkruez was actually preparing for an apocalypse, which in his case was a nationwide flood of primordial seawater. But for Teyvat, an apocalypse probably looks a little bit more biblical. Something like a day of judgment and resurrection. And if we look at the apocalypse as it is presented in Flowers for Princess Fischl, we'll notice that it is indeed described as a day of judgment, where the Gesamtkunstwerk returned to devour all things within the Immernachtreich, or Night Kingdom, a kingdom of darkness. And the Immernachtreich is where all things in existence will end up one day, meaning the Immernachtreich is the abyss, and it is the Gesamtkunstwerk that will devour it. And the way the book describes this event is actually quite similar to the description of the quest item Tears Among the Stars. You know, that thing that we get from defeating the all-devouring narwhal. A whale, or leviathan from space. And also the source of the apocalypse that Narzissenkruez was trying to avoid. And if you draw parallels between the narwhal consuming the primordial sea and the Gesamtkunstwerk consuming the abyss, then you should also make note of how this item says that when the universe is nearly dead, a new world will will move for the first time in the belly of a whale. Whales are a type of leviathan, and leviathans are a type of dragon. Ergo, worlds are born in the bellies of dragons, because dragons are alchemical crucibles of the universe. These worlds are made of and by dragons, and so dragons are born of the world and become the spirit of the world, because the world is them. It's made of pieces of them. So I personally think that when the apocalypse finally does come to Teyvat, because it should eventually, it will mark the return of Nibelung, and he will try to devour everything, reducing it to its rawest form before recreating it to match his original vision and not the vision of the heavenly principles. Nibelung will attempt to recreate himself and the world that represents him. But there is one very important final aspect to this. Flowers for Princess Fischl also says that both Fischl and her raven Oz are also beasts of the world. They are also considered Gesamtkunstwerks. In fact, Fischl is the one who is supposed to bring the judgment of the apocalypse. And Fischl is the one who is supposed to have the entire realm of the Immernachtreich existing inside of her. All things dead, discarded, or decaying eventually find rest inside Fischl. In fact, the entirety of the Immernachtreich is supposed to be inside Fischl. And in light of that, it's very interesting that the Anima Mundi is also referred to as a fish or a raven sometimes, isn't it? Now note that Fischl is the hero of her story. She is the sword-wielding princess that defeats the previous dragon. But, as the legends of Teyvat say, the hero eventually becomes the dragon. So I would like to propose the possibility that Fischl is, allegorically at least, Nibelung. But to be even more specific, I think that Fischl is the traveler while Oz is Paimon. And as a descender, the traveler will become a vessel for every will within the world, and will thus become the hero that becomes the dragon who rebirths the world. Although I do think it's worth noting that Paimon is the one who gets called a fish all the time, and she's also the one with the crown befitting of a princess, and her gender stays the same regardless of the twin that you pick at the start of the game. So it's very possible that Paimon is the one who's actually Fischl, and in fact, you could argue that the traveler is the sword that the prinzessin wields. Sure, Paimon might be useless now, but Fischl was also really useless in the play The Sword-Wielding Princess. She didn't actually become the sword-wielding princess until the very end of the story. But speaking of sword-wielding fish and outlanders, while I know she's not a descender, the game tends to place Skirk in a similar category. And I can't help but think about how much everything we've talked about so far fits Skirk's profile. And it's also worth pointing out that it is Skirk's artifact set that tells the story of Nibelung, and also her journey to learn the truth about what happened to him. And the way Nibelung describes himself in that set lines up a little too well with how Fischl is described by her narrator in her own story. Makes you wonder if there's a deeper reason as to why Skirk is investigating all of the history of Teyvat. In fact, Skirk's fish-like form and mastery over the abyss and ability to wield a sword has me wondering if she actually possesses the ability to become the hero that becomes the dragon that rebirths her homeworld. That makes her not a descender of Teyvat, but a descender of an entirely different planet altogether. And her relationship with Sertologi's pet, the all-devouring narwhal, is also interesting in this context, because not only does it have a sword-wielding hero in its stomach, but its in-game file name is Ptah-Ur. Ur being the name of a location in Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, and Ptah being the name of the Egyptian creator deity that created the world through language. So he literally spoke it into existence. And this is relevant because the dragon creation magic does seem to have its roots in the spoken and written word. I made a whole video about it if you want the full breakdown, but what I didn't cover in that video was how a dragon is the manifestation of the story of the world, which can symbolically be represented by a storybook, which is written into existence. Kinda makes you wonder if this narwhal is supposed to be the equivalent of Skirk's Paimon, eventually. Now, the all-devouring narwhal sometimes drops a lightless mass, which describes an endless darkness that glimmers with tiny specks of light. Those lights will eventually ignite bright and brilliant flames, and each flame is presumably a story, at least metaphorically. See, the Hexencircle wrote this book, The Little Witch and the Undying Fire, wherein a witch witch traveled the universe in search of the Undying Fire, which turned out to be the story of a dying witch. And the title of Undying Fire has since been passed down to Durin, who is a dragon born of a storybook and the author of his own story. So I think that these little lights are actually divine sparks, which in Gnosticism represent fragments of God, but in alchemy are related to the anima mundi. Because just as a tiny light is born of the darkness, so too is the anima mundi born of the prima materia. The light that makes the world comes from the abyss. And if God in this case is just a manifestation of the story of the world, then fragments of that story should be stories within the story of the world. And I think those stories are represented by visions because they are tied to dreams, wishes, and fate is basically the story of an individual. And plus, visions use the power of light. Also, Fischl's Gesamtkunstwerk was supposed to devour the dreams of the world and bring forth a new world from them, meaning all those little stories were going to be combined to make one bigger story, a world story, a Nibelung. Because Nibelung isn't really the name of the Dragon King at all, but it's instead what we call the manifestation of all life forms who collectively make up the world soul of Teyvat. The real Dragon King was always a nameless ruler. Nibelung is just the name of the lineage of the world, and the cosmic dragon that originally spoke the world into existence merely inherited the name Nibelung because they were the ones who sang the song of the world, the song of the Nibelungs. And this is why Rhinedottir made so many dragons, before switching focus to make primordial humans, which are vessels that could birth worlds and the dragons that embody them. Hey, welcome to the end of the video, and thanks for sticking with me through this kind of windy path. Now, for those of you who play Star Rail, this is indeed the Genshin version of the whale fall theory I made a while back. Took me a little while, but I did finish it. Now, while the names of my Chaos Enablers, who we sometimes call channel members, scroll on by, I want to share a very relevant and fun fact. Did you know that the etymology of the word spell, as in magic spell, actually comes from the Old English word for story? It's true! So when people say stuff like come and sit for a spell, they're not referring to a unit of time, but are instead inviting you to sit down long enough to share a story or two. And in light of that, I think the idea of linking witches with the power of stories is both fascinating and appropriate. And it also helps to explain why Anders' daughter was held in such high esteem. Stories are the root of all magic. Anyway, thank you for sticking with me through this roller coaster of a theory. I appreciate you watching it all the way through, and providing my editor hasn't obliterated me for accidentally doubling the original length of this thing, I'll hopefully see you in the next video. So until then, take care of yourselves and ta-ta for now.